Hey y'all, I'm Dan Hamilton, host of the Next Gen Warrior Show. As always, the Next Gen Warrior Show is brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush and our staff at the Texas Veterans Land Board. For information and resources at the VLB, check out vlb.texas.gov. Today, I am joined by a good friend of mine from the way of Washington, D.C., Jared Lyon. Jared is a U.S. Navy veteran, and he is the national president and CEO of Student Veterans of America. Jared, it's good to have you on the program today. How are you?
Living the dream, Dan. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So before we jump into the myriad of different questions that I'm interested to ask you about, as well as the resources that you provide and what the transition experience is like for student veterans on campus, tell us about your military service.
Sure. So as you know, I served in the world's finest Navy. So I essentially entered the United States Navy as what's referred to at the time as an undesignated seaman apprentice. So like in the Marine Corps, you have an MOS, same as the Army. In the Navy, you have a rating. I actually joined the Navy without a rating. So I kind of describe it as the last form of legal indentured servitude. So, essentially entered the Navy on August 5th, 2001. Shipped off to boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois. And after boot camp, I was not guaranteed an A school. So I didn't go to an A school. Instead, I was guaranteed at the time what they called a submarine contract. So I went from basic training on to Groton, Connecticut for the Basic Enlisted Submarine School, or BESS for short. There, I learned the ins and outs of becoming a submariner. And from there, I went right to the fleet. I went to my first submarine in the fleet. And then beyond that, I eventually did strike a rating in a very weird set of events. I got orders to dive school to become a Navy submarine scuba diver. So dive training is at Naval Dive and Salvage Training Center in Panama City Beach, Florida. I got those orders at nearly the same time that I had to make a decision as to my rate. So I wound up taking a rating exam that you could take the exam and become the rate without going to the A school. My options at the time were storekeeper, which is in supply, mess specialist, which at the time was what we call our culinary specialists, or those that prepare food, or admin, which for submarines is called a yeoman. So I struck yeoman. I took the YN3 exam, which is the third class petty officer exam, E4, and then I shipped for dive school. And I actually made YN3 while I was in dive school. I spent the rest of my time, my rating was yeoman. I was a pretty crappy yeoman, though. I never went to the school, so sort of did the job, sort of on the job. But I really enjoyed my time in submarines. Becoming a diver was something that I was super proud of. Loved doing that job in the fleet as well. And then I separated from active duty in 2005. So that sort of in a nutshell is my service, other than to say, multiple deployments in support of the global war on terrorism as well. So
what's life like on a submarine for a Marine who never spent any time below the water? I have no idea. What's the chow like? What's the day-to-day like?
Sure. I mean, submariners don't call their ships ships. We call them boats. Submariners are a superstitious lot, if that sort of makes sense. So we set sail as sailors on ships that sink on purpose. And so that is in and of itself the mindset of submariners. Actually, this is something I didn't realize until I left service, but a lot of my friends on the veteran side of things have been former combat arms individuals. And I've actually found a great deal of similarity in the mindset of a submarine crew and a combat arms crew, say an infantry, as a for instance. It's small, so relative to the rest of the fleet, a submarine's crew is much smaller than a ship of its size. In addition, it becomes very tight-knit. At the time that I was on submarines, it was all male, although those all-male units are becoming integrated with women, and about time from that commentary. But so it was all men, small units where you become very tightly knit, and you're all reliant on each other. If any one person on that crew or that team doesn't do their job, it could mean the safety or the life of the person next to you. Additionally, you are not surrounded by the enemy that may have the potential to kill you. Your enemy is far away, or in the case of submarines, we hunt other submarines. I was on a fast attack submarine. We're not doing a lot of that these days, but there's a variety of other things that submarines do to support the clandestine operations of the US military. But the ocean is your enemy. The ocean in a ship that sinks by design surrounds you at all times, and there's sort of constant threat of things that could go wrong. So the crew develops a real sense of gallows humor, and that sort of helps you cope. So in these tight-knit environments, that you're very self-reliant on that submarine. When the submarine leaves port, that ship, she is independent of everything else and reliant only on the crew's strength, skills, and training to accomplish whatever mission or task that is set before the crew. Sort of sounds similar to what a combat arms unit might have. Not to suggest that there's exact similarities, but the mentality of the crew, successful and the submarine force, are what I found to be very similar to ground combat arms units as well.
So how do you think that time below the water helped you in your duties now as CEO of the SVA? Is there any transition at all? Maybe there's no correlation to, maybe operating under stress. We always talk about in veteran circles, kind of the difference between, should I go out and find something like I did in the military? In your case, that might not be it might not have an opportunity to do that. But there's other people who say, hey, go out and find something different than you did in the military, which is what you did. And so I'm interested to know, how much do you, or have you relied on that experience?
Yeah, so one of my primary responsibilities on the submarine was actually as our battle station's helmsman, which is kind of Navy talk for saying I drove a submarine. And I drove a submarine under our most primary missions. So the captain will pick a battle station's crew to do certain things. And when the ship goes into battle stations, when the submarine goes into battle stations, my station was to drive. And so, I got really good at it. I'm proud enough to say that I did. Not a super transferable skill. Addedly, not a whole lot of people, are looking for somebody who knows how to do advanced hull inspections on a nuclear powered submarine as a diver outside of the submarine. So, but, there's something to be said for this, Dan. There's a difference between a peacetime generation of veterans and a wartime generation of veterans. And what we find through data in a wartime generation of veterans is that you're going to see better than 85% of our generation will do a job post-military that has little or nothing to do directly with what we did. Meaning, if you've ever used an MOS translator, right? Well, first and foremost, only the Army and the Marine Corps call it an MOS, right? The Air Force has the AFEC or whatever it is. The Navy is Navy enlisted classifications. I'm not sure what the Coast Guard has, but they're all different. So even saying MOS isn't the same. Addedly, if you sort of type into that, you find yourself like totally able to be a security guard in a warehouse or something like that, right? And so this notion is most of us are going to do something different, but we got to remember how we came to service. And in a wartime generation, what we find is that even though if you enlist, let's say versus commission, you do have a great degree of flexibility choosing the job that you're going to do in the military. But what we find is in a peacetime generation, people choose a job that might have some correlation to what they might want to do post-civilian life, right? Post-military life and their civilian life. In a wartime generation, you find that through the data, the majority of the enlisted force chooses their job by when their ship date to boot camp is. Meaning that you might have any number of things that come back after you take the ASVAB of jobs that you qualify for. And there's umpteen number of jobs in each of the branches that you could do. But very frequently, you've chosen your branch for one primary reason or another. And once you do, you choose the job you're going to do based on how quick you can get into the fight. And so from that vantage point, it's usually, okay, we have these three jobs. They're kind of similar. Well, which one ships for basic training within 3 months, within 6 months? If I have to wait 18 months for that job to come open and ship for basic training, sure, I can stay in delayed entry for a while, but most people don't elect to do that. So the vast majority of us choose our job based on how quickly we can serve, not necessarily based on a motivation of what we think we may do when we get out. And when we come into the military, we don't think of it as a job so much as we do think of it as serving our country. And so it comes as no surprise that many of us do a job when we get out of the military. It really doesn't have anything directly to do with what we did, i.e. MOS that I did in the Army to then civilian job that I did when I got out, or the fact that I was on a submariner, I drove the submarine and I was a diver, not really doing any of those things. But to your point, what did I learn below the surface of the ocean? I learned how to multitask. I learned how to be part of a team. I learned some of those transferable skills that any team would seek that they don't necessarily know how to write into a job description, that we don't know how to necessarily list on our resume. And I'll tell you, the first job that I got out of the Navy was really fortunate. I got a job in defense contracting, working at Northrop Grumman. And one of the gentlemen that was on the hiring committee for the small team that I worked with in Melbourne, Florida, was a retired Navy chief, just by luck. Now, the reason I was applying for that job is because of my security clearance in the military. So anyone with a security clearance and like the basic ability to like be a good employee is probably a good choice for that. But that chief happened to be a submariner. And when he saw my resume come through, which was horrible, if you look back at that original resume, when I first
caught a break is what you're saying.
Not good at all. But what he was able to say to the hiring committee is, listen, this kid is a submariner and a diver. That means that he can be part of a team, he can solve complex problems, and there's nothing that you can give him without limited guidance and the end state that he can't figure out, which I didn't even know about myself, nor did I know how to describe submariners as that way. But when you are just reliant on the crew, separate from everything in the world, and given a certain set of tasks or mission sets to accomplish, you just have to figure it out. If something breaks or goes wrong, you can't call in support on a submarine. It's just the crew. And so you realize that even being part of one of the most advanced pieces of technology man has ever conceived, a nuclear-powered submarine, right? And at the end of the day, its ability to do anything starts and ends with the ability of the crew, the people, to work together to solve complex problems and get things done in very ambiguous environments. And so I think that that has set me up for a lot of success in my current role, because I'll add the other notion. On a submarine, there's a backup to a backup to a backup, meaning there's redundancies in everything that you do. You start out with one plan. If that plan doesn't go right, you have a secondary or tertiary option in which you can engage relatively quickly to sort of keep your ability to maintain on target, on task, and to accomplish the mission. And I'd say that that's led to my current role in ways that I'll be grateful for the rest of my life, because it teaches you strategic planning, it teaches you resource allocation, and believe it or not, budgeting of those assets. Could be people, could be time, could be money, could be anything. And the ability to sort of do that without the expectation that you can just get more has made me frugal, a little bit more safeguarding of those limited resources, et cetera. So I'd say that's what I got.
Do you remember your first day on the job as CEO of the SVA?
I do. It's kind of a funny story. So I had been on staff before I became CEO. I was our executive vice president of operations and our head of development. So all things development operation, I was the functional number 2 to our CEO. When our previous CEO left the team, the board named me acting CEO. And then they engaged an executive search firm. At the time, the firm's name was Korn Ferry. And essentially they conducted a nationwide executive search. I think we had just over 289 applications for the position. And I was sort of the one internal candidate. And then going through that process, I sort of kept getting advanced to the next round. So by the end of this, I had made it to the final round, which there were me and 2 other candidates. To this day, I still don't know who they were, but I knew I'd made it to the final round, and we'll see where the cards fall. So I actually received a phone call from our chair of the board at the time, and then 2 other members of that committee. Both of them happen to be retired generals. One of them is still on our board. His name is General George Casey. George Casey is the previous chief of staff of the Army. And for a guy whose highest rank was E5, to say that like I have a friend and mentor who's a 4-star general still sort of blows my mind. But these 3 gentlemen, they called me to say, hey, the board had decided to make the offer to me officially. Would I like to accept? An emphatic yes. I have my dream job, and I feel very fortunate for that. But their next question was, okay, well, you'll get some paperwork done. We'll get you officially to be the CEO, but what is your next thing to do? You remember those old Super Bowl commercials? You just won the Super Bowl. What are you going to do, right?
Yep.
It's almost like one of those moments, because when it wasn't the pandemic, I was traveling a lot. And at the time I was in Atlanta on a layover from DC to Atlanta to LA to conduct a site visit for our national conference in advance of the conference, which was going to be at Disneyland. So when asked the question, what are you going to do next as your sort of first official task as the president and CEO of SVA, my response was, well, I'm going to Disneyland. So that was sort of my first day on the job. I had been doing the job in an interim capacity. So it was an easier transition to kind of the full-time official role. But yeah, I was sort of just on the road, continue to do my job.
That's awesome. So as a veteran who transitioned out of the military of the Marine Corps for 5 years, same thing as you, I got out as an E5, I moved to Austin, and my bridge to my career and what I'm doing now and my life after the service was a college campus. And it was a Student Veteran Association at the University of Texas. It was also taking classes at Austin Community College. The environment that veterans face when they get to with an academic institution or in a college is much different than the experiences that they have in the military. Can you talk about maybe ways, a couple ways that veterans can be successful once they get into an academic institution?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Dan, as well as your own story. I share so many elements of it. So the first thing is for a lot of folks, whether they themselves are a transitioning veteran or they are working with transition veterans, I think once and for all, we've got to start from the right operating position. And generally what I mean by that is that we have to understand what the majority of veterans are doing when they get out of the military. And so what we know from our data is that give or take on average, every year we as a country make about 200,000 veterans. 115,000 of those veterans are sitting in a college classroom within 7 months of separating from active duty. It is a much larger percentage than anyone is setting policy for, designing programs for, or even as transitioning service members, realizing ourselves that this idea that I feel the way that I do once I get to the campus is unique. It's not unique insofar as hundreds of thousands of veterans are doing it, right? So then you look at how many veterans are on campuses nationwide. That number is exceeding 800,000 every year. And each year we are graduating just over 100,000 veterans with either an associate's, a bachelor's, or a master's every year. So that's the pipeline. But we often think jobs. Well, this is the challenge. When I get to a college or university campus, what is the makeup of veterans? Well, 52% of us are married when we go back to school and we have children. Another nearly 20% of us identify as single parents when we go back to school. So we've just separated from active duty. We're boom, right on a college campus. And many of us, about 50% of us, will work full time even though we have the GI Bill. And another 25% of us will work part-time while we have the GI Bill. The reason being is we're grown-ups when we go back to school with grown-up responsibilities. We take care of our families while we're back in school at a period of time where we know we're taking a lower income than perhaps our earning potential might otherwise be for the purposes of achieving that degree. The second thing to note is the sheer volume of us who use the GI Bill.
Yeah.
So of those that use the GI Bill, it's always known you can use the GI Bill for vocational training, a certificate, etc. And we think that even anyone that does use the GI Bill will probably use it for that. Since 2011, less than 5% of veterans have ever used their GI Bill for non-degreed education, meaning 95% of us that use the GI Bill, we are pursuing a degree, associates through PhD and everything in between. The next assumption is that many of us will be using the GI Bill for an associate's degree. Here's where it gets a little odd. 66% of us that graduate with a 4-year degree are just like you and I. We start at community college. Very frequently, we don't necessarily graduate from community college because on average, we only spend 2 semesters there. The reason we do is community colleges, the admission is much different. They have rolling. It's not just every fall that they admit or every spring. You can take classes in the summer, et cetera. Addedly, community colleges give more generous credit for our military experience so that we can build an academic transcript. And then once we do that, and we take a few semesters, 2 is the average, we actually become really good transfer students into places like the University of Texas, or in my case, Florida State University. And so often we show up to those campuses as transfer sophomores or transfer juniors, having started at community college, but not necessarily graduated from community college. And overall, student veterans are starting to get more sophisticated in the decisions that they make. They're not using their GI Bill at community college because community college is relatively inexpensive per credit hour. So they do the math on it and they realize, geez, if I pay out of pocket for my average of 2 semesters at a community college and then turn my GI Bill when I get up to 4-year, I'll have enough GI Bill to work towards my master's degree ultimately. Okay. One of my favorite statistics is that there are more enlisted former enlisted folks with master's level of education or higher than there are commissioned officers that have that level of education. Just the rules of numbers, right? There's more enlisted people than there are officers, and a lot of us go to college. So the notion is when we get to school, we actually can feel pretty out of place. The average student veteran is between the ages of 24 and 36. The average college student is between the ages of 17 and 23. And so even at the averages, we're older, right? And as you move to the ends of those averages, you feel even older, right? So it's very easy to feel disconnected. Secondly, as veterans, we often approach college as like, college is my full-time job. You hear this a lot. I'm going to put the blinders on, I'm going to be dedicated to the books, and I'm going to graduate. Well, here's the reality. Veterans have the highest graduation rate of any subset of post-secondary education with the exception of international students. So we do really well in higher education. Addedly, we have among the highest average GPA of any subset of the country. The nationwide average GPA for traditional students is a 3.1. For veterans, it's a 3.34. So we have better academic performance. So we do really well in school. But if we put the blinders on, we rob ourselves of the bigger experience of higher education. Higher education, in my humble opinion, sometimes academics get mad at me, is 40% classroom, 60% everything else. And the biggest idea of going to college for us as veterans is to build that career, to make myself more hireable later. And the average job in America, if it requires a bachelor's degree or higher in education, over 88% of those types of jobs do not come from a job board and do not come from your resume. And nobody tells us this as veterans. Where do they come from? They come from somebody you know. And so as veterans, when we're back on campus, if we only go to class and only do the schoolwork, we will get a nice piece of paper that we can hang in a fancy frame and put it on our wall, but it doesn't necessarily mean we'll get the added benefits of that education. So the education is classroom, that's 40% of it, and the everything else along with the network. And so looking for ways to actually get to know people on campus, to get involved in lectures that are not part of credit. You know, there's a guest that's coming to campus, go visit that lecture. Actually becoming friends with members of your faculty that teach you in class. These are some of the experts in their field, but it extends beyond faculty and staff. The traditional students on our campus present a huge opportunity for added networking. I mean, you went to the University of Texas, I went to Florida State. The students that get in there, we call them kids when we're veterans because they feel smarter than us. Those kids though, they were part of a big, massive selection process. Florida State will get over 40,000 applications and admit an incoming freshman class of 4,000. That is a hugely selective population. That they're incredibly smart young people. And we have what I call an opportunity to get to know them, but I dare say a responsibility. This is the first time in American history where only 1 in 3 college students state that they know a military veteran personally, meaning no one in their family probably served in the military. Shoot, no one in their neighborhood probably served in the military. And we're veterans having a shared experience with them. Sure, we're a little older, but you mentioned your highest rank was E5, as was mine. Guess what we got really good at doing at that rank? Managing 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, right? We got good at doing that. Apply the same notion when you get to campus, and now you're like a big sister. You're a big brother to that group of young women and men who are in college. And they now get to know a veteran. And who are the hiring managers 10, 15 years later? It's usually people with a bachelor's degree or higher in education. And if they actually know a veteran, they're going to be seeking veterans to be part of their community, to be part of their teams, to be part of their workforce, even if they themselves weren't a veteran, because you gave them that opportunity to know a veteran and actually, dare I say, become friends with that veteran, which truly helps us close the civilian military divide.
I'm glad you said that because I think the experience as a student is not just going to class. It really is building relationships. And that's one of the reasons that I was so interested in moving to Austin. The calculus that I went through after getting out of the military is because I knew I was someone who probably wasn't going to blow the doors off of the GPA, right? I was probably going to be around a 3.0, something like that. But I knew if I just got in the room with people who were smarter than me, people who had more experience than me, and people who had been there before, then that education in itself was going to be as equal or even more valuable to me down the road. And that's one thing that I've also, since we've been hosting the show and learning about the different paths that veterans take in their careers and how they advance to become executive level or senior level leaders in their communities or in the businesses or nonprofits that they run, the relationship side is a critical aspect. And I think it's actually maybe the one of the most unknown thing, because I got out of the military with no network. I came to Austin by myself. I don't know if you were the same way, man, but I came out, I had nothing when I got here, but the campus atmosphere, once I allowed myself to enjoy it, once I allowed myself to, like you said, meet the people around me, once I actually engaged with some of the younger students, like you said, that I may have been a little unwilling to at the start, it really opened up a lot of doors to me, and the atmosphere became fun, and it actually became really enjoyable place.
Well, the military teaches us a key concept, especially for anyone that's ever deployed, right? When you deploy overseas, no one that has done it before you sits you down and says, hey, Dan, when you get there, make sure you stick out like a sore thumb. Right? Nobody gives that advice. We talk about the notion of assimilation, and assimilation really matters that you understand the culture of the place that you're going. We can apply this to our civilian lives in transition as well. So you go to the University of Texas at Austin, or I go to Florida State in Tallahassee, or maybe a community college, wherever I'm going to go, if I sort of assess the environment, assess the culture that's there, and find a way to become a part of it in this new way, I actually wind up watching opportunities open up to me. And then that second notion that you mentioned about executives and when they tell their stories, I'm kind of a dork for biographies. Yeah. Whether it's somebody lists their biography on the website and I try to read it before I have a meeting with them, or maybe historical figures, you can read a whole book about their biography, but I'm kind of a dork for this. And something that I listen to a lot of guest lectures when anytime a university records them, they usually make them available for free. You can get all this great information for free by just Googling a guest lecture from somebody who might otherwise have their content behind a paywall, which I don't mean to say that I'm cheap, right? So but the other side of it though, is one thing I really love is CEOs in the summer, at the end of the summer internship at fill in the blank big company or big government entity, they'll often do a leadership sit down with the interns, right? And when they do, they can't help but tell their own story. And what I find so interesting when those stories are being given by CEO X is that she tells the story of the context that she has today. And very frequently, they might have been her roommate in college. Mm-hmm. They might have been somebody that she had an economics class with in college. They might have been her sorority sister from her college sorority. And you start connecting the dots where you're like, wow, here's this CEO whose biography I hope someday mine looks like, and I want to be like her someday. Well, how do you do it? You establish genuine and authentic connections to people. You make friendships that matter. And I think far too often as veterans, we hear the word networking and we think of it as brown nosing. We think of it as nefarious. And we very frequently come from this environment in the military where it's I want to earn it. I'll earn my promotion. I'll do all the right things and I'll be rewarded by doing all the right things. But we get out of the military prepared to play chess, and we sit down to a checkers board. And that checkers board opponent is somebody in fourth grade. And we're a grown woman or man. And we feel like we're getting our butt kicked against a fourth grader until another veteran comes along and goes, hey sister, hey brother, you playing chess? And you're like, yeah. You're getting your butt kicked by a fourth grader, aren't you? And you're like, yeah. They're frustrating, isn't it? It's yeah, you're playing a more complicated game. Checkers is actually easier. It looks a lot like it. The board is checkers. It's got these little pieces. Let me show you how to play checkers real quick. And then you start going, king me, fourth grader, right? You start winning at checkers because you know how to play the game. The military prepares us for far more complex environments than the civilian world, but nobody explains that they look really similar. They're just easier. And one of the life hacks in the civilian world in learning this new game is literally that networking isn't brown nosing. It's trying to figure out how you can deliver value to others, which we all did as NCOs, petty officers, commissioned officers, and even more junior enlisted ranks than that. We all did that. We all tried to figure out how we could deliver value to others and then call upon them when we knew they could help us deliver value to others. Make friends and it leads to anything. Dan, I say it all the time. It's my earnest belief that veterans are damn good at playing any game, provided we know what the rules are. And so when we learn the rules to the game, we win. We win competitively against anybody. The difficulty is a lot of us are learning this game OJT, and exactly to your point, we're doing so without a network.
So I want to turn towards some really awesome legislation that you guys have worked on passing. And if for those in the audience who are unfamiliar maybe with the Student Veterans of America, the advocacy and the hard work that you guys have done on Capitol Hill to ensure benefits and GI Bill benefits for veterans. Jared, you led the SVA's commitment to pass the Forever GI Bill, the largest expansion of college aid for military veterans in a decade, with an economic impact of $3.4 billion. Can you talk about that process here for us?
Yeah, no doubt. One of the most interesting things that you can find out with regard to legislation is there could be an issue where 80% of Americans think it's a good idea, and it still has about a 20% chance of passing in Congress. Inversely, you could have an idea that 80% of Americans think is a terrible idea, and it still has about a 20% chance of becoming a law. And so when you start looking at advocacy, you start to realize that it doesn't matter how good the idea is. What matters is how good the solution is and how good you can build a coalition of people to advocate to have that be the case. Lawmakers don't make decisions in a vacuum, obviously. And so the bigger thing with the Forever GI Bill is, as we started to look at the GI Bill, you start to realize that when a law is made, it isn't made with the benefit of hindsight. It's made with the benefit of precedent and history, right? And then somebody's ability to interpret that and make a new law. But it's not done with hindsight. And so in hindsight, after a law has ever been made, there's that ability to look back and say, geez, if we had tweaked this or made this decision quite a little bit different, or if we had put the implementation in the parameters of this, we'd have a better outcome. So anytime you pass a law, and really the law that I'm talking about is the post 9/11 GI Bill, which was passed into law back in June of 2008. And so by 2017, we had sort of been looking at that law and saying, hey, there could be some things that we could fix. There were silly things in there where, if you had received, let's say, the Purple Heart, but didn't serve your full 36 months of active duty, you actually weren't eligible for 100% of your GI Bill. And that seemed foolish, right? If you shed blood for your country, the enemy didn't care how long you were in the Marine Corps, as a for instance. Why should your country, when you return home, for just not having enough time? So the Forever GI Bill made a fix like that. And there were a numerous other amounts of fix that seem like no-brainers. But again, when somebody makes a law, they don't have the benefit of hindsight. So with that benefit of hindsight, we tried to organize all the myriad ways that the post 9/11 GI Bill could be improved. And one of the key ones was on this idea of a delimiting date. So keep in mind that the post 9/11 generation had the response of the post 9/11 GI Bill as a wartime benefit for a generation of post 9/11 volunteers. It is an all volunteer force for our generation that left home to serve their country during a time of war and returned home. That's a little different than the Montgomery GI Bill, which was designed as a peacetime benefit for the all volunteer force, meaning whether or not there was a war, you had the GI Bill. Well, our generation is now, with hindsight, part of the longest period of sustained combat in our nation's history, period and stop. And a lot of times millennials get a bad rap. Well, Dan, I don't know about you, but I'm 38 years old. That makes me an elder millennial. The longest period of sustained combat in our country's history was fought primarily by millennials. So the next time we sort of want to look down on millennials, remember that the longest period of sustained combat fought by all volunteers was that generation, our generation. Now, beyond that, when we start looking at it with hindsight, there's this really weird thing, the delimiting date, meaning that if you serve a period of time in the military, you're eligible for the GI Bill, but it has a time limit on it. It expires. And when we get out of the military, a lot of us do go back to college, but some of us, for a variety of reasons, choose to do something different. And then we might go to college later when it could help us advance in our career, or that adding education actually makes us more competitive to change careers, whatever it might be. Well, the post 9/11 GI Bill, as written, 15 years, it had an expiration date. And so the Forever GI Bill, that's kind of the main place that it gets its name. We were able to remove the delimiting date, basically saying if you separate from active duty from January 1st, 2013 or later, you have your entire life to use the GI Bill. It does not expire. And that's where it gets its moniker, the Forever GI Bill. It's actually referred to in statute as the Harry W. Colmary Education Assistance Act of 2017. Forever GI Bill for short, much like Montgomery GI Bill is a nickname. Even the GI Bill itself is a nickname.
Well, I want to thank you and your staff and everyone else on your leadership team who advocated so hard for that and has been really providing some really incredible resources for veterans across college campuses around the nation. And I'm interested to know, you have a really interesting perspective. You get to meet with young veterans who are at the very beginning of not only just their career, but their lives. And you also spend time in Congress, and you spend time with elected leaders, and you spend time at the White House. And I was interested to know, what's that experience like? Can you tell us how you maybe manage some of those either professional relationships at the executive level, and kind of what the feel is when you go to a college campus and you're doing essentially working with the constituents of who you're serving, who the SVA is serving. And I guess in my mind, it seems maybe a little bit to be a juxtaposition of these two really different worlds that you are navigating. And I was just kind of wondering how you approach that.
Yeah, Dan, I appreciate it. I feel like one of these folks that benefits insanely from an amount of dumb luck I can't really explain. So I get to do something I love on behalf of a group of people I care about deeply, because I believe that they're a solution to challenges that face us as a country. Now, I don't mean anything that I'm about to say to sound, one way or another, or dare I say even political, but I think as a nation, we suffer from a leadership deficit as a country. And I know that there is this group of women and men who have all volunteered to be part of something greater than themselves in service to their nation, in defense of our Constitution, by having served in the armed forces. That leadership to them isn't ambiguous. It's not something that they can't explain what it is. Whether they led themselves or were part of organizations that they were directly connected to leadership, they know what it is. When you add to that the transformative experience of higher education, these individuals, the educated generation of veterans, are capable of remarkable things. And when you look at it overall, if you look at the percentage of Americans that have either what's called some college or a degree, it's only about 55% of Americans fall into that category. When you look at our generation of post 9/11 veterans, 70% of us fall into that category, which means that our generation is among the most educated subsect of Americans, period. And yet, even as veterans, a lot of us don't think that many of us go to college, when the majority of us actually do. A lot of leaders sometimes find themselves saying, well, geez, I mean, let's be honest, if they were smart enough to get into college, how'd they ever wind up in the military? As if to infer that military service is done by only those who had no other options. Our generation volunteered to do something when our country needed us to do it. And when we get out of the military, we're still willing to participate, and we are more civically engaged than anyone else. By the time this airs, it'll likely be after the election, but in our nationwide survey, 94% of student veterans told us that they were registered or that they were intending to vote, and 92% of student veterans are already registered to vote.
Wow.
We get out the vote campaigns all over the country trying to get more college students to vote. And I'm like, well, veterans are already doing it, because we step up and we lead. And so the juxtaposition is that I get to work with people at the beginning of their transition, the newest veterans among us. But I also get to work with senior decision makers. And I don't find the experience to be all that different, with one key exception. The key exception is that, people who haven't had the firsthand experience of being a transitioning veteran, as you and I have. So I mean that as much as, people who serve for 40 years on active duty, they're retiring from the military. That's a little different than transitioning out of the military, having served what most people do. Most people only serve for 5 or 6 years. It's less than 20% of the entire armed forces will ever reach a military retirement. So most people don't retire. And when you transition out of the military versus retire, you transition with no health care, you transition with no pension. You're trying to figure out life having the experience of the military, but not it being a sole part of your identity. And so I work with a group of people trying to not go to college to find themselves. We leave that to high school kids. Our generation of veterans go to college to create ourselves in our own new image of what our civilian lives are going to be and how they impact ourselves and our families. Whereas decision makers, having not had that experience themselves, I mean, we're at all-time lows for members of Congress having been a part of the military, veterans. If you look at the News and World Report of top 100 American universities, 2 or 3 of those university presidents are veterans themselves. We just have a lot of people in decision-making roles these days in 2020 that themselves haven't served. And so there's a bit of a disconnect in their understanding of the population. And never out of malice and never out of sort of malintent does somebody make an assumption about the veteran community. But the brand, the American knowledge of a veteran, doesn't match with the data. And the data demonstrates that, yes, we have some challenges as a generation of veterans. I'd never purport that we do not. But those challenges are far outweighed by success stories of our generation, period and stop. And that we are the solutions to the challenges that face America. And so in that juxtaposition of being able to work among newly transitioned veterans, work alongside them as leaders of SVA chapters nationwide, I have the ability to see the promise of tomorrow in real time. But I also am seeing who leads today. And I know that there's a deficit in who leads today that can be filled by who's ready to lead tomorrow. And it's sort of bringing those two groups together as frequently as possible lets those in positions to make decisions realize that veterans are assets to society. We're not deficits. That literally we are the ambassadors of the all-volunteer force. If we as society can understand how successful people are after they take off the uniform, whether they serve 4 years or 40, we know that more young people will choose that option to continue to help our country succeed and prosper. And so connecting the dots for people in positions to make decisions with the people who they're making the decisions on behalf of is sort of the nexus that I sit at. The intersectionality of those two worlds on a daily basis, I think, reminds me of why I wake up every morning super fired up and excited. And it sort of gives me the right North Star to make sure that that population has everything that they need to not only succeed, but to thrive post-military service.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of the veterans, student veterans across the country, as well as veterans around the nation for the work that you do at the Student Veteran Association. I know here at Next Gen Warrior, we're always trying to encourage the success stories of veterans, and I appreciate you being in a leadership position to be able to really make those stories come to life. Before we close out here today, I wanted to see if there was anything maybe that we didn't get to hit on, or maybe something that you would like to leave our audience with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that if anyone has any interest in learning more about Student Veterans of America, clearly hit us up on our website at studentveterans.org. A plethora of information there, but primarily highlight the programs and events that we do on behalf of our chapter leaders all over the country. And one of our biggest upcoming events are 2. In January, we'll have our 13th annual national conference. So registration for that will be open. You're welcome to sort of get more information. And if being part of, well over 3,000 post 9/11 veterans who are all coming together to learn how to build better communities that are inclusive of veterans on college campuses nationwide, we'd love to have you join us at our national conference. You don't have to be a veteran to attend. The event is for student veterans, but anyone can show up. And then the next one is our Washington Week, which usually happens the last week of February or the first week in March. Of course, due to COVID, we are in a shifted environment throughout, so we're sort of looking beyond that. But Washington Week historically is where we deliver our top policy priorities on behalf of student veterans nationwide to a joint hearing of the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committees. That is typically live streamed, so it gives a really great opportunity to hear the latest and greatest top 10 policy priorities on behalf of veterans each and every year when we deliver them to Congress. Even in COVID, if that winds up being virtual, it'll still be a great opportunity to sort of engage and understand the things that are most salient, most relevant with regard to federal policy for our generation of veterans in higher education. We call them veterans.
Well, Jared, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show with us today. You have a really incredible story, and I know you have such a passion for serving the veterans community across our nation and around the world. Thanks for being a guest on Next Gen Warrior.
Thanks, brother. Really appreciated it today, and it's great to see you again.
Absolutely. Good to see you too. On behalf of Chairman George P. Bush and our staff at the Texas Veterans Land Board, thank you once again for joining Next Gen Warrior. We'll see you back here next Monday.
Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior Podcast.